Hello, everyone, and welcome to Open Source in Business, a speaker series aimed at broadening the perspective on what it means to create business opportunities around open source. So far in this season, we've talked to bigger companies who are using open source as part of their supply chain. We've talked to smaller companies that are creating businesses, creating commercial products on top of open source projects that they've created with bootstrapped, without taking venture capital. We've talked to people who have created businesses, consulting with companies about how to create businesses around open source. So we've covered a vast array of perspectives, and today we've got one that I think is going to be very interesting. I'm joined by Matt Asay and Matt Klein. Hello, gentlemen.
Hey.
Hey.
And Matt Klein, I'm going to have trouble differentiating between the two of you. I'll go with Matt A and Matt K, if that's okay.
Sounds great.
So Matt K,
even,
5.5
even that may be a problem. You call him Matt and call me whatever you want. Call me AC. I don't care.
So Matt, 5.5 years ago, you started the project Envoy, which has become a massive success. Can you tell us a little bit, what was the original context for creating Envoy? What was the business context, the business problem that you were solving with it?
Sure. Yeah. So I started at Lyft, the ride-sharing company, about 5.5 years ago. And at the time, Lyft was, it was a little bit into its microservice migration. So Lyft was a monolithic architecture. I think at the time that I joined, there was maybe 80 software engineers or something like that. So still a relatively small company, and had started the microservice migration and had maybe 20 or 30 different microservices. And at that time, I think Lyft was facing a lot of the problems that many companies that migrate from from a monolithic architecture to a microservice architecture face. Lots of uncertainty around observability and networking, and Lyft already had a polyglot architecture. The monolith was written in PHP and had some Python services, and there was plans to start writing services in Go. So lots of the typical problems that you hear from people around the pains of actually scaling out a microservice architecture. So I was hired from Twitter, where I had worked on Twitter's Edge proxy, and I was tasked with helping Lyft go through its microservice migration. And just having worked at Twitter and seeing how Twitter did its Edge proxying, how it did its service proxying. Prior to Twitter, I was at AWS, where I worked on networking. So, I had observed how different people solve these problems. And I think when I came to Lyft, I felt that there was the potential to build a new type of system that would allow us to combine both elements of Edge Proxy API Gateway, as well as what we now call Service Mesh. Obviously, Service Mesh has a lot of buzz behind it, but at the end of the day, it's really just the idea that I have a bunch of services that are written in different languages, and I have to do a bunch of things. I have to do load balancing and service discovery, et cetera. And I felt that there was an opportunity to evolve the space and build a new proxy system, and that became Envoy. And just the very brief history is Envoy was originally deployed at Lyft as an API gateway. So it was actually not originally a service mesh proxy. So we rolled out Envoy at Lyft, and it helped us with observability in terms of all of the API calls that were coming into our system. And then pretty quickly, we decided to run Envoy next to our monolith and started doing various things with MongoDB, and that was really the beginning of the service mesh. And even from those very early days, our developers at Lyft found a lot of value from the observability and the logging and the metrics and the load balancing that were coming from the connection between the API gateway to the monolith. And then from there, the rest is really history. We rolled out Envoy throughout all of Lyft, and by the beginning of 2016, we had a relatively complete service mesh, and that meant that Envoy was running at the edge, was running next to every service, and it formed the backbone of how we really rolled out the microservice architecture at Lyft. And then we obviously moved towards open sourcing, and the rest is history.
Well, but Matt, let me push back a little bit on that, and we've discussed this before. when you say the rest is history, you had this great system, service mesh that you'd built that was doing really well for Lyft. There's a lot of technology. I think I heard it said long time ago that most software is written for use, not for sale. Or most software is written for use, not for open sourcing. Or isn't open source. Talk a little bit about that jump from we've got this great thing that we built and everyone at Lyft is happy to, oh, we're going to go open source this, because most companies don't make that jump.
Yeah, I think there's two parts to this, and it's something, there was a big Twitter thread, I don't know if it was yesterday or the day before, and part of that discussion was, I'm a big believer that when you build and operate software hand in hand, you create better software. So I think, especially in the infrastructure space right now, we see most of the open source and most of the products, they come from the major cloud providers, they come from venture-backed startups. I think very few of the projects that have found wide success come from end users, meaning they haven't come from users that are building it incrementally to solve business problems that they're facing at that time. So I really strongly believe that when you have to operate your software and you have to, solve real business problems that you're facing, it just leads to better software. It leads to software that is easier to operate, that has the right features for operations, that actually solves real legitimate business problems. So I felt very strongly that developing this thing at Lyft, and in some sense, Envoy is a V2 to what I had worked on at Twitter. So, that's also part of this, is I had some experience building a proprietary system at Twitter, learned a lot of things from that, made lots of mistakes like all people do when they go from a V1. So Envoy took a lot of learnings there, and I felt very strongly that we had developed something good. Now, we can talk about what happened after open sourcing later, right? It's like what has happened, I never would have imagined. But at the time, in early 2016, I think we were fairly confident that we had built something that was good, that was, relatively easy to operate, that solved a bunch of business problems. We were relatively confident that other companies like Lyft in Lyft's peer group would probably find value. And I think really what the decision process is twofold. One is that Envoy was not Lyft's primary business, right? Like, Lyft is a ride-sharing company. So, at the time, there was no plan to get into the infrastructure software business. So I think in the spirit of open source and having built some of these systems in the past, and honestly just having a feeling of, well, if this is valuable to us, it must be valuable to others. This is not our core business. If we're successful here, maybe we can amplify our effort by putting it out there. I think that is what pushed us to initially have these conversations. But I think that, and I've said this before, I think a big part of it though, and again, we can talk about this more, is that I think a lot of us were fairly naive about what was really involved in doing open source. So the initial conversations in 2016 were honestly very, very simplistic. And they basically boiled down to, we've built this thing, we think it's valuable, we don't really know how to do open source really, but it's not our core business, so let's do some open source. And that's about the extent of it, to be honest.
So some of the risks that you hear people talk about when they talk about open sourcing software is, we're going to spend all of our time solving problems that are not our problems, right? Yeah. We're going to get all these end users. They're going to be pulling the project in ways that are not aligned with what we want this project to do. Was that ever a problem for Envoy?
So the way that I typically talk about this, and now with 4 years of open source under my belt and being fairly tired and somewhat burnt out and jaded at times, I have my eyes wide open to the realities. And this is what I tell people now, which I didn't know at the time, is I really believe that the vast majority of open source that's put out there, not by hobbyists, but for people who just want to do it for fun. I'm talking for like companies that do it for some reason. And again, we can talk about everyone has different reasons. But I think that the vast majority of open source that's put out there is actually a net negative. And by net negative, I mean not net negative to technology, but I mean to the company that put it out there. I think that they're probably putting more out than they're actually getting back, right? Like there's more effort going into answering questions or fielding patches or like doing work that isn't actually related to the business at hand. Whereas I think very few projects that are put out there see the level of massive success where the effort gets amplified, right? And the effort that you're getting back is a net positive. You're getting back more than you're putting in. And Envoy, by every measure, has been an incredible net positive. I mean, Lyft gets so much more back from the larger community than it puts in. But it's taken a lot of effort to get to that point. And I think most projects don't get there. So I always caution people to think through the realities of open source and how much effort has to be put in. And I think a lot of people like me, right, in early 2016, I didn't understand any of this. And in fact, it's probably great that I didn't, because I might not have open sourced. But I think most people don't understand how much effort's involved. And I think it's an important thing to actually think through this carefully.
Well, let's come back to that. And you said it was kind of a simplistic conversation in 2006, I think 2016, when you were trying to determine what to do and you were advocating for open sourcing it. What was the winning argument? You didn't know how hard it was going to be. So to get people to sign off on it, I presume it was, we'll get other people, they'll shoulder some of the burden of development, or?
I think it was the common arguments or the common reasons that people typically give for open source are the ones that we chose in 2016. And again, what I also typically counsel people is that there's lots of reasons to do open source, and the reasons don't necessarily have to be the same. So for example, my reason in early 2016 is I just thought open source would be something that would be good for my career. It would allow me to learn about something that I didn't already know about. So for me, it was more about, I don't want to go to another company and build something like Envoy again, right? If we keep building this thing, we built something like it at Twitter, we built something like it at Lyft. Why would we build it again? There's clearly some need for something like this. So let's put it out there. It's potentially good for my own personal career. From Lyft perspective, I think on the company side, the reasons are typically around, if Envoy were to become successful, it's good for recruiting. It's good to make Lyft appear as a front running technology company. So I think those were the two main reasons. Those are probably the main ones. I think because even then we understood, you don't know what's going to happen in terms of actually getting people to use it. I think it was always a nice to have. It was a dream that we would get so much usage, right, from actually having it out there, that we would get a bunch of value back. But I think the main reasons initially were career focus for the people that were working on it and company focus from a recruiting perspective.
So now, 4-ish years later, 2020, Matt Klein, would you make those same arguments again if you were doing the next Envoy, or would you use different arguments?
I would probably use the same ones. I don't think they've really changed. I think from what I've seen, particularly in the infrastructure space, I think engineers generally like to work in open source. They feel that it's more engaging. They feel that it's good for their career. So from a recruiting perspective, I really do believe that most engineers, if you push them, if they're choosing between having impact that is solely company focused, and of course that impact can be huge, or having impact that spans both the company or organization that they work for, as well as the open source projects that they might, they don't have to lead them, but I mean, even just submitting patches to open source and feeling engaged with the larger community and being able to go to conferences potentially and write blog posts. These are things that almost every individual contributor that I've seen really enjoys and values. And from a company perspective, just looking at the reality of how much software costs to develop, it's obviously in a company's best interest if they can take open source technology and they can mostly get what they need and potentially contribute some patches. That's almost always a better way of operating. So no, I don't think the arguments that I would make would change in any way. I think it's good for individual contributors. I think on the company side, if a company has successful set of projects, it's good for recruiting. They're viewed as a technology leader, but I think the thing that I realize now is how much work goes into a successful project, and it is extreme, and there's lots to unpack there, but also just how rare it is. And this is my takeaway, is that I do not really believe that starting an open source project or open sourcing something is really any different from starting a company. And I've said this many times, but I think that, like, if you look at when you do a startup, you're going to focus on all these things. You're going to hire people. You're going to have marketing. You're going to have engineering. It's like you have all these things that have to come together to make that company successful. It's really the same for open source. You have marketing, you have PR, you have engineering, you have like hiring, finding maintainers and contributors. And if you don't do all of those things well, your project is probably not going to be successful. So there's just as much work involved. And in the early days of Envoy open source, the project exploded fairly quickly, and looking back on it now, I'm far enough removed that I have a bit more perspective about that time. But 2017, particularly the first half of the year, was pretty difficult for me. I mean, the project absolutely exploded, and we didn't really have yet the infrastructure in place to support me. Like we didn't have all of the other maintainers and all of the other contributors, and it was like a startup that had exploded and was entering hyper growth, and really like all of the same things that would apply from starting a company applied there. So it's been a journey for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. I think another commonality is that when you start a company, often the person who founds the company or the founding team has to do a little bit of all of those things. And that's something that's also very true in open source projects in my experience.
It's funny. And I think sometimes people have asked me, hey, Matt, it's like you started this amazing project. It's like, what have you learned? And it's really interesting because I do not think I've learned almost anything technically in the last 4.5 or 5 years. I mean, sure, I've learned a few things here and there. But my learnings are all related to more, I think, management. It's more about being a startup founder, right? It's like dabbling in PR and marketing and like public speaking and writing and like all of these things that just need to get done to make the enterprise successful. And a lot of what I do all day, even now, not related to Lyft, but related to Envoy open source, is I don't do much coding anymore. I do all the things that fall through the cracks, like kind of like the CEO typically does. Like I just do all the things that no one else wants to do. And I often joke that the higher that you rise in any enterprise, the worse that your job actually gets. And I think it's just being the backstop to all of the things that just need to get done to make it successful.
So the first time that I came across Envoy was I discovered it through Istio. It was included as the proxy for like the data plane for Istio's control plane, if you like. And so that raised two questions for me. Would you say that the adoption by Istio of Envoy as the proxy was kind of the inflection point for Envoy, or did that come before? And the second question is, what was the control plane that you used before Istio came along? Because I imagine that all of the problems that Istio solved were problems that you had.
So we don't use Istio at Lyft. So Lyft still has a fully custom control plane. Like many adopters of Envoy still use a fully custom control plane. So since Lyft developed Envoy, we started with flat control files, and then we developed APIs, and it's like really the control plane at Lyft has developed organically. Again, this comes back to what I was saying before, is that we can have a discussion about some of these projects, but in general, some of these projects are developed by a group attempting to theorize what problems they're trying to solve for a bunch of other companies. Whereas at Lyft, the system developed organically to meet the business needs of Lyft at the time. So Envoy developed organically, the control plane developed organically, and I think that's led to a better outcome. Now, when Envoy was open sourced, so just to give some brief history, prior to open source, this is in the summer of 2016. I think we thought, well, like, would it be great if we open sourced and we would have someone that would talk about it or potentially use it? So through our contacts, we went and talked to some of Lyft's peer companies at the time in 2016. I don't exactly remember who we talked to, but I think probably companies like Slack and Airbnb and, Square and Stripe and like those types of people. And really, everyone that we met with was very excited about the feature set that we had put together and was very impressed with what we had done. But if you think about these companies of similar size to Lyft, who are running their infrastructure with a handful of people, asking them to do a lift and shift from whatever their current solution is to something like Envoy is not something that's going to be done overnight, right? I mean, that's going to be something that will take a long time. So I think by the end of the summer, we went back a little bit with our tails between our legs and said, I guess we're just going to have to open source and see what happens, because no one's going to adopt this right now, right? Like they all gave nice feedback, but there's no one that's going to adopt it right now. And so we open sourced, and what we saw really quickly, which in hindsight sounds very obvious, but it wasn't obvious to us at the time, is it wasn't the small companies that came right away. It was the big companies. Like Google reached out. I think actually they found out about Envoy prior to open sourcing, and that led to the eventual Istio integration. But Apple came along like 2 weeks after open sourcing. Like Microsoft came along fairly quickly after that. And I think what was interesting is that the big companies had been experiencing some of the pains of the existing solutions in the space. And I think they saw the feature set of Envoy and the code base and the fact that we're going to do it in GitHub and et cetera, and they were really excited about it. And they had the resources to start to invest quicker. Now, to answer your specific question about Istio, at the time that Istio adopted Envoy, that was absolutely huge for the project, right? It's like Google has been a fantastic partner, and the amount of resources and effort that they've put into Envoy has been fantastic. So at late 2016, early 2017, to be honest, like getting in there was almost like getting acquired, right? I mean, it's like I felt like I was under that level of scrutiny of trying to do whatever it took to actually get them to adopt Envoy, because it was pretty clear to me that if that happened, it would lead to an explosion of growth. Now, what's interesting is that as important as Istio was at the beginning of 2017, at this point, it's just one of many, right? Like Envoy is so widely adopted now that I don't really consider Istio to be any more or less important than the tons of users that we have across all the major clouds, all of the products, like all of the end users. So, but again, we keep coming back to this conversation of like, it's not that different than starting a company, right? I mean, the minute that you can land your, first initial major customer, as it were, huge for the project. So yes, like absolutely getting adopted by Istio, and then as has been since announced, Google is using Envoy in a lot of their cloud products. So things like their cloud load balancers and things like that. Getting them on board was actually a much higher hurdle than getting Istio, and getting them on board in the again, beginning of 2017 was really the major boost, because if you look at most of the effort that Google has put into Envoy, most of it has actually been from the cloud load balancing folks and not from Istio. Like Istio has done a bunch of work for sure. They've done fantastic work, but it's the cloud load balancing people that have just they've just been the engine, right? That has just pushed the project forward. And again, they're really the ones that I thank deeply for saving me in 2017, because if it wasn't for them, I probably would have died, honestly.
So we have a question from the audience. Josh asks, you mentioned that some of the benefits that Lyft hoped to get from having this project be successful were things like PR benefits and recruitment benefits. Now, at this point, Envoy has become the dominant service mesh agent. Has Lyft actually seen those benefits?
So people ask this a lot, and unfortunately, this is one of those things that I think in our industry, we like to theoretically be data-driven, right? So it's hard to get actual data on this, because it's not like everyone that comes in the door who we hire, it's like we give them a questionnaire and say, like, why did you choose Lyft, or why do you work here, or something like that, or why do all of these things happen? So it's really hard to give a definitive answer to that question. Anecdotally, I can say that it certainly has helped. Like, there are many people that have come to work at Lyft because of Envoy, or because of our involvement with the open source community around both Envoy and Kubernetes and various other projects. So I think that it has helped. Can I measure and prove to people how much it has helped? No. And I think this is a problem in general within the industry, is that when it comes to discussing the inherent value that open source provides an organization, it's difficult to impossible to come up with firm numbers. So a lot of it is really based on subjective assessment. And I think that's honestly why it gets tricky sometimes, because particularly for executives that are looking at numbers, it's hard to prove to them and say, look, like, this brings in this type of value. And I don't have an answer to that other than that at a certain point, we have to look at the subjective assessment of the value and try to come to some conclusion.
Maybe quickly, parenthetically, I'd say, so my team, I run the open source strategy and marketing team at AWS, and we wanted to evaluate something similar to what you just talked about, Matt, and that is, what is the impact of public perception and open source? If you're doing open source well, does that lead to tangible benefits? And to your point, it's a hard question to answer. We did find in survey data that the vast majority of people, at least of those who responded to the survey, said that active open source involvement does have a significant impact on their purchasing decisions. Now, we also asked a follow-up question. So would you leave your current cloud provider if they were perceived to be a bad open source citizen? And most of them said no, but I think there's something in between there, where there's maybe I'm not going to immediately pull the plug on the cloud, but as I'm making decisions, it's going to have an impact on where I go. And in your case, it's like, where do I want to work? I want to work where I can be seen and do stuff in the open.
Right. I think there's two sides of this, and they're certainly related, but they're also independent. And side one is what you talked about, which is from a vendor or a cloud provider perspective, what do your customers who are buying your products think? And then, as we all know, the engineering space right now is super competitive. I mean, it's a great market for engineers. And I think the question is, where do engineers want to work? And again, like, I don't have any data. I haven't done any real studies here, but anecdotally, I can look at how Microsoft has turned itself around, again, from a public perception perspective in the last 5 to 10 years. It is incredible. I mean, it's like Microsoft has gone from 10 or more years ago being, absolutely associated with anti-open source evil to being like
they were the great Satan.
I mean, they are open source now, right? And so And I can say for myself, and I think for people in the industry, the perception is I mean, it's real, right? And I think it weighs into where people want to work and where they want to be associated with. So, again, these things are hard to prove, but at the same time, I think I intuitively know that it's true. But, as you say, Matt, we often get pulled into conversations, particularly with executives who are trying to figure out where and when to spend money. And it can be very hard to give hard data. And if someone is looking for hard data, I don't really know what to say to that exactly.
So I'd like to change tack a little bit, Matt, because the thing that led me to reach out to you as kind of a potential guest was your blog post on Medium about why you don't want to create a company around Envoy.
Sure.
And you start that company by saying that as soon as Envoy started to get popular, you started to get these people reaching out to you and saying, we'd like to invest in your company. Can you tell me the first time that you had a conversation with somebody who said, you should start a company and I want to invest? And what was your reaction to that? Like, I can imagine that that's kind of another, like an Alice in Wonderland moment almost.
The first VCs that contacted me was actually in late 2016. I mean, it was right after open sourcing. I'm not going to name names, but there are different types of VCs, and some of them are quite technical and are very tapped in, right? So I think some of the VCs that contacted me very early on in fall of 2016 saw the announcement, saw the feature set, like probably already initially, thought that there might be some commercial legs there. So started to have conversations there. It was really, though, in spring 2017 where things became a little nutty. And I think that's partly when Istio shipped and announced their Envoy association and started to become clear, how much uptake was already happening after only 6 months. And I was just getting bombarded by VCs, and a lot of people being fairly pushy about like, you have to go start a company. Why would you not do this? Blah 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 blah. And a big part of a bunch of those pitches were not even around money in terms of making money, but I was told by a bunch of people that, the only way to have the open source project become successful is if you start a company. Like, if you don't start a company around it, no one will care. And I remember at the time thinking that was not true. And I wrote about that in the blog post in summer of 2017. And what's really interesting to me is I reread the blog post that you're referencing recently, and I hadn't read it in quite some time. And I still stand by everything that I wrote in that blog post. Like, literally, I would not change a line of that blog post. So it makes me feel more confident that my thought process at that time was good. And the part of that blog post that I am most satisfied by is proving all of those VCs wrong that told me that if I didn't start a company, that Envoy would never be successful. Because I felt at the time that actually, by not starting a company, it was going to be more successful. Because if you look at who came to the table very early on in the project, we have Google, we have we have Microsoft, we have Apple, like we have various other companies that are full-on competitors, right? Yet they're collaborating with each other. And because I was not working at one of those companies, I think I had always been viewed as a neutral party, right? That was not going to try to steer the project into one entity's camp or give someone an unfavorable advantage. And I think now, to be honest, at the end of 2020, I could leave Lyft, right? It's like I could start a company. I could go work for one of the cloud providers. And I don't think it would substantially change the project, because I think the project is so established at this point. Like, so much investment has been poured in that me going and working for some company or starting a company or doing something along those lines, I don't think it's going to substantially change anything. But at the time, I think it was really important. And I think me being neutral and again, without getting into any details, I have always, one of the most entertaining parts of this journey for me has actually been mediating between not only companies, but between teams within companies. Like I have gotten brought in to be basically an external mediator, right, for entities that are fighting with each other about something, right? Hey Matt, like, can you come and talk about this with us or something like that? And I never would have had that opportunity had I gone and worked for Google or had I started my own company. And everyone would have always viewed me skeptically and said, well, Matt, you will have an ulterior motive here for sure. And again, like now the project is so established that I don't think that any of that really matters as much anymore. But at the time, I think it was very important. So me staying neutral, I think really pushed things forward. So at the time, really, the crux of the blog post in terms of the business is I think that open source in terms of a business perspective is really fascinating. And of course, it's a topic that is talked about endlessly right now, right? It's like, how do you make money on open source? How do you balance between enterprise features and open features? And again, like we can talk about any of this more. But Envoy, because it's a data plane component primarily, really hard to have a SaaS service, right? Like there's no SaaS Envoy. Like it just doesn't really make any sense. Like, yes, maybe you can do some API gateway stuff. And I actually wrote about that in the blog post that I think doing like a hosted Envoy based API gateway is interesting. And we've seen people go that route. But on the data plane side, on what we call the service mesh side, there's no really easy business model there. And again, without, I don't want to point fingers in terms of Envoy's competitors, but one of the reasons that Envoy has become so fantastically popular in such a short period of time is because we do not have there's no open core. It's like there's no enterprise version. And that actually is one of the reasons that it's become so popular. So the way that you look at Envoy's competitors, the way that they are trying to monetize is they're all open core. Like they all have an open source version and then an enterprise version. And no one wants to pay for the enterprise version, or they get angry about the feature lockouts or alienates the community. It's like, there's all these different reasons. So I just didn't feel that Envoy itself was amenable to an obvious business model like, say, a database or like, say, an observability system or something like that. And I think that the types of companies that you've seen spring up around Envoy have really showed that blog post is still true, meaning you have some API gateway companies. You do have service mesh companies, but honestly, most of them are more targeted from a services and support perspective. They're not necessarily trying to provide the service mesh be all and end all. So yeah, I feel pretty good about my decisions back then.
Matt, let me ask you a follow-up question on that. So much of what you described with the business model problems stems from vendors getting involved or vendors being behind those projects, and they're just trying to figure out how to develop the project and sustain the project with revenue so they add more development. In your case, you work for a company that doesn't have to directly monetize Envoy, and that sounds like a huge benefit. So how do we get more Lyfts doing more Envoys? Like what's the secret? Like, because the way you described it sounds like you went into it totally naive. And hopefully nobody will listen to this and think, that sounds really hard. Now I don't want to do it. We will actually want people listening to this saying, I want to do that. How do we get more Matt Kleins and more Lyfts doing more Envoys?
It's something I think about a lot, and I wish I had an answer here, but I don't. This is such a hard problem. And it's like, if I look at the history or the recent history of some of the open source side of things, the only example that I can think of that most closely resembles Envoy is probably Kafka. I mean, it's like, Kafka was built for LinkedIn and then it got spun out. And, there's a couple of other examples like Hadoop and I think maybe the most recent one might be Vitesse now with Planet Labs, that came out of actual production usage. And I'm sure there's more, but there aren't that many. And this is such a difficult topic. And I think that.
So maybe let me ask
Sure.
a different way then. What would be your pitch to, we'll call her Maddie Kleiner.
Sure.
So your female doppelganger at a different company at Loft, not Lyft. What would you say to her to encourage her or potentially others like you to do something like Envoy?
I think the first thing that I would tell anyone is you have to focus on business value, right? It's like that is the first and foremost thing. So when I talk to anyone, I always encourage them, look at the business problems that your company is facing and look at the existing solutions. And I think where this gets really tricky is that, and this is why I was thinking before, not giving a fully formed thought, is, as you all know, there is so much money right now being poured into particularly the cloud native infrastructure space. And this is money from cloud vendors, money from customers, money from venture capitalists, right? There's so much money coming in. There's so many different solutions. And because of all the money and the effort that's being poured in, that encourages companies to start and cloud providers provide more solutions. And where this gets really tricky is that from an end user company, if we at an end user company are doing our job well, we are looking at, what I call TCO, the total cost of ownership. We're actually looking at, what would it take to buy this thing from a vendor, or what would it take to use open source and run it in-house, or what would it take to actually build something from scratch. And as an industry, we're really bad about actually calculating TCO because in some cases it's impossible. It gets back to the question of the value of open source. Like there's some subjective calculations here that you have to guess at because the numbers can't be proven. And so I think the first thing that I would say to people in my situation working at end user companies is you have to start by looking at the available solutions. Like what do the vendors provide? What is available in open source? And look at the business problems that are actually that the company is facing. And again, I'm a little bit jaded, right? But if I look at the cloud native space right now, I see a lot of solutions that are in search of problems, like not problems that are in search of solutions, right? And I think that end users are uniquely positioned to understand the problems that need solutions, not the solutions that need problems. And I think that end users, when it comes to some of the open source capabilities, particularly if it's not their primary business focus, I think there's potentially a lot of opportunity to think through, how does the existing technology, how does it not work for me? And that may be on the networking side, it may be on the observability side, it may be on the database side, it might be on the orchestration side, or maybe on a, like a platform as a service side. And I just believe that when end users look at their business problems, they've done not a fake effort, a real effort to actually look at the existing solutions to see if there's something that they could buy or something that they could build and adapt or build from scratch. And I think if they've checked all those boxes and they say, well, like none of these things work, or there are problems that are enough different that if I were to try to use this open source thing, whether because the community is toxic and not welcoming, or because it'd be too much changes, or they won't take my patches or whatever, man, there might be a real opportunity here. And I think that's what I would encourage, is I would encourage people to look for real opportunities that need solving for their business. And then if there's no available, solution out there, again, it's how I would start a company. It's like, is there product market fit, right? I mean, it's really the same analysis. And I think when you look at product market fit, end user is I think about working at Lyft as Lyft is a captive customer for Envoy to a certain extent, right? It's like Lyft is committed to Envoy. I sit next to the deployment of Envoy at Lyft, so I have a really good pulse on what are the problems that people are facing. Like, what have we done as a project that's bad, right? I think when you can get a bit too far, you can, as a vendor or even a cloud provider, you can get a bit too far removed from what that looks like. So that was a long-winded answer, and like I wish I had a better answer, but the only answer that I have is to look for real opportunities that aren't solved by the market, and here's the big and this is where it gets tricky. And this comes back to your previous question about how did I convince Lyft to open source, or what were the motivations? I think having a real honest conversation with management about engineers' career goals, like what do they want to do, what do they want to accomplish, what do they want their impact to look like from the company perspective, how committed or not are they to open source, because open source requires a big commitment. I came very close to burnout because in 2017, I was effectively doing 2 jobs without having an honest back and forth conversation with Lyft. So I think these conversations just have to be had a bit more often and upfront and more actively. So in summary, and I apologize for the very long answer here, very complicated topic, but I think look for product market fit and have open and honest conversations with your management about what their assumptions are about open source. And I think that's the way that it has to start.
So I think that's a nice segue to a second question we got from the audience, which is, you mentioned earlier that Envoy has actually very little competition as the service node, as a control plane or the data plane level. Would you credit being an end user implementer with Envoy being like a good enough solution? And also, you mentioned you're being an end user implementer, you're not working for a vendor who's invested in the project. So which would you credit more? You being the Switzerland of Envoy, or being an end user implementer, meaning that you're solving a common problem that a lot of people have in a way that's just good enough?
I think it's both, but if I had to pick, I would pick the latter. I think it is more important to be an end user implementer, particularly for these types of components. Because again, like just from the beginning, in terms of some of the operability features that Envoy included, it's because I was on call for Envoy. I was on call for the thing that was the pre-Envoy back at Twitter. It's like I am aware of what it means to be an SRE and to operate these types of systems at scale. So if I'm going to do the thing, like I'm going to make it so that my on-call is less painful, and that's just being perfectly honest. So I think that being an end user implementer is quite important. Once open sourced, I think being the Switzerland, the Switzerland entity is also important. But I think that end user implementer really is a forcing function for proving that the thing actually works at some definition of scale. Now, it gets really complicated here because there's all types of different factors. But I think that's probably the thing that comes to mind. I mean, the other thing that I would say is it's not that Envoy doesn't have competition. It actually does have quite a bit of competition. I mean, at least in the software proxy space, there's Nginx and HA Proxy, which are both projects that have been around for 20 years and are hugely successful. So like and they're great projects. It's not like we have no competition. And, for newer systems, there's plenty of other proxies out there. So it's not that there isn't competition. I think the market is, and again, by market, I just mean the consumers of open source, I think is being driven forward by a bunch of different factors. And that's why I think sometimes when we have these conversations, people look for one answer, right? It's like, Matt, tell me the magic of why Envoy became popular, right? And it isn't one thing. It's the fact that we're on GitHub and we have CI and we have a really welcoming community. It's the fact that we have no open core. It's the fact that I was a Switzerland thing. It's the fact that like I'm a decent writer and I can write blog posts and I can go speak at conferences and do meetups and it's like, so like I'm kind of a developer evangelist too, right? there's just like, there's no one thing. Like, it's the fact that the code works pretty well, or it's pretty robust. You can't point at one thing. It's a factor of many things. It's being in the right place at the right time. Like, if we had, just for example, Istio was going to use Nginx. And if we had open sourced Envoy, even 6 months later, Istio probably would have already been committed enough to using Nginx that I don't know what history would have looked like. Like, that would be a completely alternate reality, that we may have ended up in the same situation, but we may very well have not. So, as in all things in life, it's a matter of luck, like execution, being in the right place at the right time, like all of these things that have to come together. And there's no one thing.
So before we wrap up, I do want to ask you whether you mentioned that a number of companies have built API gateways on top of Envoy. Solo.io is one we discussed before going live. They've got a number of gateway products that are based on Envoy. Red Hat, the company I work for, has an Istio based product, so we're in some sense productizing Envoy as well, and there are a number of others. Do you ever have any regrets? Do you ever feel like that you've left money on the table in some sense by not developing kind of some of those products that have been developed on top of Envoy? Or are you happy where you are, having done what you've done, and just working on Envoy as a component of an ecosystem?
I'm a very privileged person. I have made more money than I need without starting a company around Envoy. So part of what makes this conversation hard is that I have to be honest about my own situation. And a lot of my responses to these questions are certainly, they're colored by the fact that I've already made a lot of money, right, from working at a bunch of these internet companies. So it's easier for me to say that I don't care. And it's not that I don't care. It's like it would be, sure, that might be one path that I could have taken. And I'm not precluding that I will never do this. Like, as I was saying before, I think things have changed a little bit since I wrote that blog post. I think the project is a lot more stable now. And it's not that I couldn't start a company now. It's just that being in a position of relative privilege and not needing to worry as much about the money side of things, money has never been a very compelling argument to me. So I have often, setting the money aside, I've been more driven by impact. And at least up to now, I have felt that I can have more impact on the overall industry by being independent, right? And it's like, whether that's still true, again, is probably debatable. Like, as I said, I think things have evolved, but I do not have any regrets about the path. Well, that's not true. I think there's always regrets, or there's hindsight about wanting to do things differently. But honestly, most of the regrets that I have are actually around 2017 and not better balancing my Lyft situation with the open source explosion. So those are more interpersonal regrets. But at the same time, I don't know that I would have made any different decisions because I had to do what I had to do, right? But no, I don't really ever think about the money side of things.
Matt, do you have any final questions or thoughts? Matt Asay?
No, I'm very grateful to have been able to sit in on this and participate a little bit, but I knew that Matt would be fantastic, and you didn't disappoint.
Yeah,
thank you so much. Yeah, these are topics in general that, as I've said a few times, I don't think we talk about these things enough. And I think that, one of the things that we didn't touch upon a ton, but it's actually related, is just that we have a lot of critical software that people depend on in a variety of different situations, whether it's via vertical products or services that we know and love, right? And it's not it's not always super clear how the software is maintained. Like what is the status of the people that work on it? How close are they to burnout? Are they actually in the jobs that they want to be in? Like whatever their requirements are, that would allow them to keep working on these things. And I don't have any answers here. Like, I think this is a really tricky topic, and it comes back to what we were saying before, is that it's really hard to prove the value of open source. And it's like, I don't really know how to prove that or not. But I do know that for a bunch of these projects, if the maintainers quit, we are, as an industry, in a world of hurt. And I think we have to have more conversations about how to sustainably compensate some of these people and give them sustainable jobs, and have enough people that are working on it, that are paid to do it, that we don't get burned out. And it's like, from a company perspective, companies are always focusing on, what's the bus factor, right? Or like, where are the single points of failure from a human perspective? Relatively little thought is given to this from an open source perspective. And I just think we have to have that conversation more. And I think the reason we don't have it is that it's very easy to point fingers, right? It's very easy to pass the buck and say, well, that's not really my problem. Like, it's not, it's just a thing. It's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. And again, I don't have any answers, but I think it's important to talk about.
I saw an analysis by the company Lyft recently that said that the top 10% of an application stack is written by the people deploying it, so they own the code. They're responsible for it. The bottom 20%, infrastructure, operating system components, C libraries, those are typically supported by large vendors. So you can offload the risk there. And then you've got this middle 70%, which is all of the application libraries, the dependencies, the language runtimes, the developer frameworks, the testing and programming tools that are all, essentially, we don't really know how they're developed and maintained, and there's very little commercial.
But you talk about
run them.
But even core libraries, we're actually looking at this recently, because we're looking at the supply chain of software for Envoy. And just very quickly, because I know that we're almost out of time, we're looking at zlib, right? Like, zlib is probably, I would imagine, one of the widest used pieces of software in the entire world. Like, it is literally everywhere, right? And there's basically no one working on zlib. I think like the last commit was from like 2 years ago, and there's like open issues. And I mean, it's just, there is critical infrastructure that is not really maintained right now. So it's a large conversation that has to be had.
And one we should have at another time.
Yes.
Thank you, Matt and Matt. Thank you both for your participation in this. This was a pleasure for me. And I will be getting the video up on YouTube later today. Next week we have a treat. We have Limor Fried, Alicia Gibb, and Jason Kridner. Limor is the CEO and founder of Adafruit. Alicia is the executive director of the Open Source Hardware Association, and Jason is the founder of the BeagleBoard and BeagleBone projects, talking about some of the models around open source hardware. How do you balance investing in developing software to work with your hardware when your primary product is not the software? So I'm looking forward to that conversation, and I will bid you all farewell. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Yep.